All right, Ian here from 79 Sports Therapy. Welcome back. So it's week of lockdown 753, and what better way to kind of spend the time than a whole video all about me. Okay, so a little bit of a lie. It's not technically actually about me, but much more my kind of journey. And this sort of came about because I was speaking to a patient the other day who sort of asked, when did you kind of start doing this? And I kind of realised, like I graduated in 2007, like 13 plus years ago. I kind of thought, obviously I've learned sort of quite a bit in that sort of time, a lot of sort of trial and error. And I kind of thought, well, if I was graduating now or just starting my journey, so just going to university now, whether it be as a sports therapist or a physio or osteo or whatever it is, what would I want to know? How can I sort of provide information that might sort of guide, you sort of through that journey, understand kind of what's out there, what you may well sort of find. Plus also, obviously if you're, patient, just a kind of regular person watching this kind of thinking, do you know what, like I'm not doing this, man. I'm not learning this. I'm not at university. That's perfectly fine. You may well sort of understand it's actually how, my journey, this sort of past sort of 13 years has kind of shaped where I am at, where I'm at now in terms of as a clinician. Let's get into it with point number one. Okay, so look, it is hard. Like not just COVID hard, like COVID has been a whole other range of hard. But it's hard just starting out, right? It's hard to get a job. When you are in that job, again, we generally have to work quite hard when we're there. It's a lot of long hours. It's a lot of learning, quite beside just actually sort of treating patients. Just the life is difficult. The way in which, a lot of the sort of system works, a lot of the fitness industry in sort of general, starts quite early in the morning, finishes quite late at night. So guess what? That's what we end up sort of doing. Certainly if you're working, in and around sort of sports teams, again, it's kind of sort of similar kind of things. Certainly if we're working in sort of amateur sport, that's generally kind of what happens. So it's pretty long days, both with the clinic and matching up into sort of sport. I mean, to give an example, my sort of first year out, when I sort of graduated, my first job actually was with London Scottish Rugby. So that was great, working up in Richmond. We do Monday and Wednesday evenings, sort of 6 until 9:30, something like that. And then Saturday game, lovely. Also picked up a kind of clinic job, not close to Richmond at all, in a place called Hook, which is down in Basingstoke. Actually at the sort of same time I was living back at home with my parents on Hayling Island. And if you know any of the sort of geography of sort of south of England, they're not close to each other. I think the trip up to Hook was about 40 miles. The trip up to Richmond was about 78, 79 miles, something like that. So like on a Monday, for example, I'd sort of start clinic over at Hook at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, after a kind of 40-mile drive, obviously. Finish clinic 2:30, 3 o'clock, drive up the road to Fleet Services on the motorway, on the M3, have some food, stick my head down in my car, have a quick little snooze, drive up to Richmond, start work up at Richmond sort of 6 o'clock, be back to back until 9:30, leave then, drive all the way back down to Hayling, so 78, 80 miles. And then, sort of just start work the next day, sort of bright and sort of breezy. And that was kind of my life for, the best part of sort of that sort of first year. Now, I do realise that sort of quite a lot of people sort of don't go into sort of jobs like that, and or have a little bit more of a kind of settled kind of work life. But just be prepared. That's what so often, our first kind of few years, once we kind of graduate look like. Similar kind of thing as regards holiday. I mean, I think, certainly that sort of first year, like I really struggled financially because of a lot of that sort of travel. So, that idea of sort of taking a holiday, like I don't think I took a holiday for the first 3 or 4 years out of after sort of uni. And I think, again, getting into that mindset that that's likely to be the case. It's not always the case, but that may well be the case. Then obviously we then throw on top of sort of patients. So with patients, again, we've got to keep our knowledge base up. We've got to go to CPD events. We've got to be learning. We've got to, be broadening our sort of skill sort of horizons. We've got to be doing the right thing for our patients, in a way in which we are treating them correctly, in accordance to what we already know, in accordance to guidelines, in accordance to kind of health and safety. Obviously, as I say, as regards to COVID now, we have an additional level of sort of protocol sort of on top. So yeah, it is hard. Ultimately it is kind of what you sort of make it, but be prepared. There is some hard work that needs to kind of lay that groundwork, certainly over that first sort of couple of years after you graduate. Look, I think mentors are really, really sort of overlooked. I sort of come at this, from the point of view of like, I still speak to my mentor now, let alone sort of what I did, when I sort of first kind of graduated. So my mentor still is the girl who was sort of head therapist at London Scottish when I was there, a girl called Neve. She's back over in sort of Northern Ireland now. And she's great, so in particular during this sort of COVID time, like there's been a lot of kind of groupthink and sort of hive mind kind of stuff kind of going on. And Nick's been really sort of important for me in terms of sort of bouncing sort of ideas off of. Certainly in those sort of initial kind of formative years, that sort of first sort of 3-4 years out, after sort of graduating, really, really important for me to understand my skill set, understand my sort of ideas, in and around sort of the way in which I approach things, the way in which I can kind of streamline practice, et cetera. And, a lot of sort of what I learned from her in that sort of initial kind of formative years, like I still do now. And as I say, that idea of, well, I'm still, 10 plus years, since we kind of worked together. And I still refer back to her for ideas, for kind of hive mind sort of stuff. So look, I think mentorship. I think in particular when you're a student, you kind of think of that as just being just a university thing. You've got to think about that a little bit more broadly and actually understand that mentorship is still important to get guidance from people who know more than what you do. Whether that be theoretical or through life experience, it's still really important. Even when you get further on, sort of down the line, and you're old and grey like what I am. Okay, do you know what? Like, I wish somebody when I was at university had told me to build a brand. Man, it would have made so much. Would have made like this past sort of 3, 4, 5 years so much easier. So when I graduated, obviously, as I said, I graduated in 2007. Like Facebook was only just a thing. So this idea of like having a brand and making that brand sort of across all your sort of social medias and all your platforms and blah blah blah, and even sort of building a website, like that wasn't the done thing. The done thing was you got a job in a clinic and you worked in a clinic and then you got a job in another clinic, and you sort of, that's how life sort of went. Or you had got a job in sport and you got a job in sport, right? No one kind of said, well, what happens if you want to set up your own clinic, or you move around clinics and you want to sort of make sure that people understand where you're at. The idea of building a brand kind of wasn't really a thing. I think it is happening more now, and like I'm only sort of figuring that out anecdotally because my social media is now followed by a load of sort of sports therapy and physio students. That's really, really cool. But I think it is a really, really sort of important thing. Even if you are working, within a team, whether that be a clinical team, whether that be a sporting team, set up your own brand. Make sure you have branding across social media. Make sure you have branding. Make sure you have a website. Make sure you have a functional mailing list. All these kind of simple little things that I certainly didn't learn, and I definitely learned the kind of hard way when I had to try to set up 79 sports therapy, and all of a sudden I didn't have any of that. So I think it is really, really important to do so. Definitely try not to make it about yourself rather than about a place, so that then you can then move it around geographically. It is so important to set that up now rather than try to sort of depend on sort of setting it up when you need it in the future. Okay, so look, another thing dating back to kind of when I was finally graduating, 2007, this idea of fighting for kind of representation. Now, obviously, sports therapy as a whole has been fighting for kind of representation, across a load of sort of different sort of platforms, whether that's with, within the sort of musculoskeletal community, whether that's for sort of Health Professions Council sort of recognition. That's been happening for ages. Like I remember Prof. Graham Smith, head of Society of Sports Therapists, coming into university when I was like first year, second year, and telling us all about that sort of regulation through Health Professions Council, and that's all really cool. That's still going ahead. That is still ongoing. That is still an ongoing fight for us. I think it's really important to continue to fight for that. So any time in which there is an opportunity to shout for sports therapy, as a protected title, as a sort of important sort of therapist base in itself, I think do so. Take a stand. Make sure we are vocal. On the importance of the work that we do, and that fight for sort of fight for sort of representation. Definitely support Society of Sports Therapists in that, because without doing so, we don't get to the point that where we are a protected title. I think that is changing, and I think that this kind of COVID time has definitely sort of changed that. We're being certainly the society, we are being shown as being on the sort of same footing as kind of physios and osteos and chiros and all of that, which is really cool. But we still need to keep on fighting it. So anytime there is the opportunity to fight and push it, do so. It is super, super important. And in a similar vein, know your worth. Know how much, we should be charging people, when we are offered jobs. Know your worth within a team. Know your worth within, your group of peers. It's so important. I mean, again, even within people that I sort of work with, when you get called, when you are referred to as just a sports therapist, we need to fight against that. The same applies as regards, when we are trying to sort of take on jobs and people are sort of, probably fleecing for us for a little bit of sort of cash. And again, a lot of this sort of dates back sort of a little while, but certainly in and around sport, there is always budgetary constraints you're coming up against. Certainly in sort of more amateur sport, understand the amount of work that you're being asked to do for that money. One of the sort of funniest jobs I ever got offered. I was sort of in discussions with a local rugby team. My flatmate at the time sort of played for them, and he was like, we're in desperate need for a sort of first team physio. I was like, of course, and I'll sort of pop down. We're having really good sort of productive discussions with the sort of club owner, club chairman, and it was all kind of good to go ahead. The plan was that I was going to effectively kind of run most of the sort of medical under the auspice of the sort of team doc. But basically, he wasn't there most of the time, so effectively do everything. And if you think about what do everything means, it's not just poking, prodding, taping, strapping, and doing all the fun things on sort of match day. It's also all the admin and all the paperwork, and obviously sort of making sure that there is a sort of continuity of sort of care across the entire spectrum of the senior team. It's 50 plus players, etc., etc. And we got on to sort of speaking about sort of money, and I kind of thought, well, do you know what, somewhere around sort of £22 an hour kind of makes sense, with a bit of flexibility for travel, obviously. And the offer came back of £10 an hour, which is an insane amount of money, insanely small amount of money for the amount of the volume of work that I was being asked to do and the quality of care I was being asked to kind of provide. Understanding your worth and not just taking just any paycheck because that's the paycheck will come. That's so important. You definitely need to fight for that, because, as I say, certainly in amateur sport, there are a lot of people that will pay you as little as possible to do as much as sort of big a job as that job would entail. Okay, a fun one. Treat the symptoms. Super simple adage. It was actually sort of taught to me when I rocked up at London Scottish. I was on placement on my third year there. Before obviously I then got a job after sort of university. And the guy there, the head sort of physio, a guy called Doug Jones, super amazing physio, is up in sort of Manchester way. Has been bounced around a load of sort of different sort of pro sports, super cool. Pretty sort of early on sort of taught me this idea is just, if in doubt, treat the symptoms. And to be honest, it kind of applies to a lot of things, right? Like there are a lot of sort of injuries that we can get sort of over daunted with, things that seem really big, that actually you kind of think, well, how do we get from where this person is now to where they kind of need to be? We kind of think about, the sort of big ones, things like sort of ACLs, how do we break that journey down? And I suppose to an extent, this idea of treating the symptoms is a lot more about process driven and sort of next job driven, right? Again, a lot of sort of sport is, based around sort of principles of sort of next job, which is kind of like, well, if you make a mistake, if you do something, well, you can't change that. What's the next job? So you just do the next job. And we don't worry about the sort of 80 minutes, 90 minutes or what have you. We don't worry about the sort of big picture. We don't worry, if it's an ACL, we don't worry about what, that sort of 9, 12 months sort of outcome looks like. We just go, well, what's the next job? So, for example, if you've got a patient that's sort of coming in, even if we can't sort of diagnose exactly kind of what it is, but has some puffiness, some swelling. Well, how do we sort of deal with that? Well, we might sort of rest from aggravating activities. We might put some ice onto it. We might, elevate it. We might compress it. So that's kind of fairly kind of simple, right? If they are struggling with simple function like standing on one leg or walking, using a crutch, well, can we teach them to do that? Yeah, we can. We're not worried about, well, what's the diagnosis? We're not worried about, how do we get them back to, running, jumping, kicking, what have you. All we're worried about is, well, how do we just make that ankle function a little bit better? And then when we see them the next time, so, well, have they improved? Have those markers improved? If they have, cool, top bananas. Right, let's reassess. Where are we at now? How do we then move them sort of forwards? So I think for me, actually treat the symptom kind of underpins a lot of sort of what I do in a very kind of basic format. It's a little bit more broad than that, and there's a little bit more specificity around that. But if you can just remember sort of one thing, treat the symptoms, actually underpins a lot of what we do in and around sort of musculoskeletal care. CPD. Look, we think of CPD as either going to, kind of courses where we kind of don't really learn a kind of huge amount new, or we go to kind of conferences and we kind of hang out with people that probably know more than what we do, and we drink really, really crappy coffee, right? And yeah, look, it's quite a lot of CPD is that. But, it's also reading. It's also, reflecting. It's, it's so important in terms of making sure that we're A, up to date, but B, we're progressing. The worst thing that we can sort of do is just get stuck on, well, this is what I've already learned, and I'm not going to sort of learn anything more on that. And I think, one of the things to kind of remember is actually, university is really good, and it does teach you an awful lot, but it doesn't teach you everything. We are still learning all the time, whether that be sort of learning sort of experimentally, and in terms of sort of experience. Or whether that's sort of learning because we're actually, going out and actually learning, because we're actually, reading things, because we're going to conferences, because we're sort of interacting with our own sort of network, with peers outside of our network. And I think that, again, it quite a lot of the time, CPD looks very prohibitive just in terms of the sort of costs. When you think, sort of £200+ a day for a conference, it can be quite sort of restrictive. But I think, as I say, don't think of CPD as purely something you go to. It can be something you bring to yourself. So as I say, in terms of, reading something sort of, whether it be a sort of journal article, whether it be a book or what have you, being involved within that, is really, really important. Obviously, from a sort of journal sort of point of view, again, some of them are sort of prohibitively kind of expensive, and you may not necessarily kind of have access. In particular, if you just come from university, you're very blessed with having a volume of sort of access, and then when you get out into the real world, you kind of don't. There are quite a few sort of quick, sort of cheap little sort of journals that do kind of wrap-up-y kind of things. Or actually, one thing I sort of found was Twitter. Twitter's a really good resource for, again, this sort of idea of sort of hive mind. A lot of sort of scientists being on there, and again, you pick and choose what your kind of network looks like. But again, being on there, you'll actually kind of find that there's a lot of scientific sort of discussion going on, a lot of sharing of sort of free resources, and it's really, really important, sort of good sort of network to kind of tap into. The additional kind of measures, obviously, sort of being a sort of Society of Sports Therapists member, we get free access to BGSM. Really, really important. And again, staying sort of up to date with that, again, really sort of benefits you. Even if you're not necessarily seeing a patient that that article is talking about, just staying up to date with your sort of sort of critical analysis skills, I think is also sort of massively important. Take a break, think, do. One of those things that I used to teach to any sort of students that had sort of shadowing me, certainly in relation to sort of exams. So obviously, a lot of our exams are practical. So you kind of get asked the kind of questions, pretty kind of high pressure environment. Get asked the question, you kind of think, first thing that comes into my head, out it goes. And actually, quite often, just take that break, have a little sort of step back, have a think about what the question is, have a think therefore what the answer is, and then say it. That applies to private practice, that applies to kind of everything that we sort of do. I think a lot of the time we kind of get flustered because we've got a patient there, right? The patient's paying money, and the patient, money is time, and the patient's kind of thinking, well, come on, get on with it. Actually, sometimes we just need to kind of go, okay, I'm not sure, I need to think. And have that time to think, have that time to sort of appreciate and appraise what the information is telling you, and then let's go, then let's do, then let's make a diagnosis, then let's make a plan. You don't have to do everything at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Sometimes if you need to take extra time to kind of assess something again, or if you need to take some time, to be, pretty sort of conservative in terms of your management and just kind of be like, right, well, our intervention is going to be pretty minimal, and we're going to see how that sort of changes this one aspect, this one outcome measure. Don't be concerned about that. The most important thing is that patient is getting the right level of care. And sometimes the right level of care is actually that we're not chasing something, and we're not being aggressive, and we're not progressing them through week on week on week on week. Sometimes the right level of care is actually just making sure that we're getting progression. And that progression might be very, very minimal, but that might be the right level of care for that patient at that time. So when was the last time you admitted you got something wrong? It doesn't happen often, right? Because we're always right. But I think actually in reality for us, we have to be critical of that. We have to appraise, well, actually, I don't think I got that one right. And it's okay to not get things right. That's fine. As long as we have a clinical justification for why we did something, it's okay. But I think it's important to actually understand that, if we do get something wrong, then we say, I got that wrong. And I got that wrong because I've appraised and understood why I've got that wrong. And look, that obviously sort of extends with everything that we're sort of doing, making sure we are being critical of sort of what we do, critically appraising what we do in and around clinic, in and around with patients, is a massively important factor of how we progress forward. If you keep on thinking that everything you do is absolutely world leading, you will never get to being world leading. Understand where you are sort of in and around that sort of environment. Make sure you are able to critically appraise exactly what it is that you're doing, because otherwise you will not progress. Yeah, sports science, that kind of throwaway half of our degree, right? that sports science is really important in terms of sort of what we do. It's not just for number bods. It's not just for geeks. It's not just for kind of, sort of like PE teachers plus, it's a really, really important sort of component sort of what we do in and around clinical practice. Just in terms of the sort of basic sort of nuts and bolts of what sports science is, right? So, strength and conditioning, or sort of strength development, force development, power, that side of things. Biomechanics. Biomechanics is huge. Don't neglect it. Physiology. All of these things massively impact in terms of sort of what we do. When we talk about biomechanics, in sports therapy, but it's kind of quite niche. It's kind of quite sort of specificity to joints. In reality, I don't just see a joint in practice. I see a joint within a system, and that system is moving in all different sort of directions. So understanding biomechanics is really important. When we start to talk to, for example, a golf player, and we're sort of relating his hitting mechanics to, somebody hitting a cricket ball, and somebody hitting a baseball, and somebody throwing a javelin, because biomechanically they're all very, very, very similar, if not identical, at its sort of base level. So biomechanics actually really matters in that sort of scope, outside of just, spin glide and roll, for example. When we talk about physiology, physiology, again, we kind of think of that as being, well, that's what like elite athletes do, right? But actually, we apply the sort of same physiological kind of sort of environment or capacity to kind of develop when we're talking about our sort of couch to 5K runners. When we're talking about the people who for whom the sort of highlight of their sort of sporting life is running a park run, right? Physiology is physiology, right? If we're getting somebody back to fitness, we're getting somebody back to fitness, regardless of whether they're an elite athlete or they're a couch to 5K. They've never run, they've never moved in their life. When we're talking about sort of strength development, so our sort of S&C side of things, strength and conditioning side of things, again, when I'm rehabbing somebody to kind of get stronger, I need to understand how they produce more force. I need to understand if they're an elite athlete in particular, how do we get them more powerful? What's the difference between strength development, force production, and power? Right, how do I apply that into their sort of rehab process? Because they might not have an S&C coach we work with. I do work with quite a few athletes who have S&C coaches, and we have a really good relationship. But me understanding kind of what they're doing and them understanding what I'm doing is massively important in that sort of relationship. So being able to actually discuss and have a back and forth with those guys is hugely important. The guys I often sort of refer to is an S&C group up in Richmond called Arete. Hugely wealth of knowledge there. Again, I know a few of those guys obviously from my time at London Scottish. Again, still 10 plus years on, we're still working together. And again, with those guys, we can have that back and forth because I understand their language and they understand my language, and it becomes a more blended sort of environment. So actually, making sure and understand and have a grasp on the sports science side of things will hugely help, not just in terms of when you're treating patients and rehabbing patients, but also then, again, having that discussion within a sort of multidisciplinary group, which, invariably that's what we should be aiming for. We should be aiming to be able to work in that sort of multidisciplinary group, because that's how we then get athletes and patients better. And with that in mind, don't be afraid of other sort of clinical disciplines. Right, again, this whole idea of sort of multidisciplinary or sort of blended sort of clinical teams, I think is really, really important. Like, we've all got skill sets that all of us can sort of appreciate and sort of, learn off of, as well as sort of use within a sort of clinical kind of setting. Again, in particular, if we're working in sport, you will be thrown into a multidisciplinary team, and you need to have a conversation with the doc, with possibly a chiropractor, sports massage, physio, sports rehab, S&C, as well as in the coaching staff, in a manner that you can, again, have that sort of discussion that is all on a plane. So not just speaking in sort of sports therapy or musculoskeletal terms to, a coach who may well not understand it, but being able to kind of put that into their language. And into a language that the sort of whole team, can can sort of understand and sort of relate to. That then definitely sort of transcends across into kind of private practice. And as I say, when we are working with or referring stuff out to guys, so, that might be a sort of S&C group, that might be a surgeon, that might be, a doctor, a GP, that might be, whoever it is. We've got to be able to work within that sort of multidisciplinary format, as opposed to just think, oh, I'm like the best, I know everything. Being able to kind of go, do you know what, that's not my remit, I'm going to refer you off to this person, or that's not my job, I'm going to sort of refer you sort of over there. Within that, obviously making sure you can build a network. So having a network of other sort of clinicians of varying different sort of clinical skills, again, it's really, really important, just in terms of sort of just helping you have a degree of flexibility with where you can then sort of send people. So, for example, if I've got somebody who comes to me who sort of says, this is kind of all cool, but I also kind of want some information about sort of nutrition and what should I eat, and how do I sort of lose weight, or whatever it is. Okay, I know some stuff about nutrition, but I'm not a nutritionist, right? I'm not a dietitian, so I'm going to sort of refer them off. So I've got a network of two or three guys that I sort of refer to from that sort of point of view. So making sure you have that means that patient is then getting the best from you, and you're giving them the best sort of level of care that may extend beyond your own skill set. So when we're at uni and we're talking about skills, we're often just talking about clinical skills, like clinician skills. So, can you palpate? Can you assess, diagnose? What are your, mobility skills like, massage skills, whatever. Look, they're really, really important. But in reality, our biggest skill is actually communication. It's asking how patients are. It's, saying, well, when I do this, how does that feel? It's actually talking to them. It's giving people sort of confidence, allowing people to understand what it is that we're sort of seeing and why we're saying what we're saying. One of the things that sort of annoys me the most when I sort of see patients that, I've seen other sort of clinicians, I'll say, well, what's your diagnosis? And they'll say, I don't know. But they've seen somebody else. What did they say about your injury? What did they say about the structure? What did they say about the mechanics? What do they say about sort of what you need to kind of do? Well, I don't know. They didn't really sort of say anything. And that really annoys me, because I think, well, it's not hard to discuss with somebody. And that's kind of part of sort of what we do, right? The vast majority of sort of what we do is discussion. Certainly sort of at the moment where we're doing a lot more virtual sort of appointments, that's pretty much most of what we've got, right? So we've got a voice, let's use it. Some of us have a slightly dysfunctional voice, some of us have a stammer, and it's very difficult for me to kind of communicate with patients. Certainly towards the sort of back end of the day, if I'm kind of quite tired, brain's a little bit sort of frazzled, I find it really, really difficult, but I still do it. And I still do it because it's a really important part of sort of what we do, the way in which we operate, the way in which our clinical skills show through. It's much more on the communication side of things. Patients are going to leave, and be more adherent to what we're asking them to do if we can explain why they're going to do it. If I just give somebody exercises, they're going to go, cool, awesome, what am I meant to do with this? If I explain why they're important, if I explain what their issue is, why their issue is, and what we're going to do about it, so what the plan is, sort of long-term moving forwards, they're much more likely to adhere to that as a program, and much more likely to kind of progress. Just because you might be a little bit shy or a little bit sort of introverted, again, me to a T, put on an act. So every time that patient sort of walks in, chest goes up, shoulder blades go back, big smile on your sort of face, and you go, hi, how are you? It's very, very easy to do, and it makes a world of difference in terms of how the patient perceives you, and obviously then from there, what the sort of objective outcomes are then likely to be, because they're much more likely to do what you ask them to do if they can see why it is you're asking them to sort of do it, and that you are engaging with it. Okay, so all of that said, trust your basic skills and your knowledge. Trust what you've learned at university. Again, a lot of sort of what I do now isn't necessarily, exactly, sort of what we learned at university, and everything's sort of developed on and, sort of moved along. But all of the basic stuff, the basic, palpation, the basic assessment, the basic diagnostic skills, the basic critical analysis skills, the basic massage skills, basic rehab skills, communication skills, all of the basis of that was all learned at university. The only thing I've done is over the years, we've just developed on that. So we've developed, slightly more sort of refined ways of doing stuff, slightly improved sort of communication skills, whatever it is. It's all developed off of that groundwork, that amazing groundwork that we all get at university. So make sure you actually understand that actually we can trust in that. That is there. That framework is there for us to then apply additional kind of stuff on. We are not just binning that as soon as we leave and going out afresh. We're using that as a framework with which to hang new skills, new development on sort of top of, in a way in which we can then sort of progress from that. But that's us for this time. Obviously, stay safe and well. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, comment below, and let us know about your own journey into the big wide world of sports therapy. See you next time.